It's a very, very well. Good morning. Uh, Today we have a very nice seminar dealing with some more social science aspects of mangroves, not only social science, more environmentally social science. And we have the pleasure to have Professor Rebecca Borges. Rebecca is a researcher at the Institute for Functional Marine Biodiversity and the Alfred Institute at the University of Oldenburg in Germany. Professor Rebecca has extensive experience in mangrove management, mostly dealing with local communities and traditional populations. She's a marine ecologist by background, but she does research on social-ecological systems, mostly on spatial planning, co-production and exchange of knowledge with traditional population, governance of marine commons in the context of the present capitalist crisis. And the aim is basically uh, have an environmental view of anti and decolonial epistemologies and the struggles related to conservation ethics and modern human relations, which is a topic that for us that work with mangroves, it's a key. Most of mangroves have large populations of traditional people. I have commented that in my first lecture. That depends not only on diet and materials, but also spiritual aspects of mangroves. This relationship is very well developed where Professor Rebecca works in North Brazil, and also many of our colleagues that I see here from Asian countries also knows a lot about that, about the importance of mangrove to local people. So I will invite Professor Rebecca to the seminar, and I hope you enjoy the next 15 minutes with this magnificent lecture. So Rebecca, the stage is yours. I'll be back in the end for conducting questions and discussion.
Thank you, Professor Druji. Can everyone hear me well? Please shout if something is not working. I'm going to share my screen, and I probably won't be able to see a lot of what's going on in on Zoom. Apologies for that. But if something is not working well, please let me know. Okay. So I hope you can all see my my slides. Yes, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I am Rebecca Borges. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Helmholtz Institute for Functional Marine Biodiversity, also known as HFMB. As Professor Druji just mentioned, the HFMB is part of the Alfred Wegener Institute and also part of the University of Oldenburg here in Germany. And I am part of the Marine Governance Group at HFMB. So first of all, I want to thank Professor Druji for the invitation, also for the many years of collaboration on research on mangroves. And I also want to thank the International Institute for Environmental Studies for organizing this series, especially to Raquel Scott for clarifying a lot of questions that I had and making sure that I got the time right. I am in a different time zone now, so that can be very tricky sometimes. And today, as you can see in the title of the presentation, I will talk about mangrove conservation and what I believe are three important aspects of mangrove conservation, which are systematic planning, community-based management, and I will talk a little bit about ecosystem-based management, not too much, unfortunately, due to time restrictions, but I'm happy to answer any questions that arise at the end. All right, so let's get started. And yeah, I just want to start with, actually, let me go to just a minute. Yes, I just want to, before going into the more introductory part of the literature, I just wanted to let you know that I will focus on as Professor Druji said, the more social part of the ecology of mangroves. So I will move away a little bit from what we've seen in the past two lectures. We saw a lot about biology and maybe a little bit of biochemistry of mangroves. And we saw a little bit of ecology, but more coming from the natural science perspective. And today I will talk a little bit more about the social part of the mangrove conservation puzzle, if you will. And because of my current research and also because of my background, being born and growing up in Brazil, I am more familiar with Brazilian mangroves, and I will focus the presentation on Brazilian mangroves today. But I do hope that talking about Brazilian mangroves can serve as a sort of launch pad for, wider or even more global discussions. And of course, I'm not able to go into detail about the realities of other mangroves, but I would be very, very interested in hearing, if any of you are familiar with other realities of mangroves. I would be very interested in hearing more about at the end of the session. And yeah, let me just go back to what I wanted to show. Yes, I just wanted to show like a brief overview of the lecture today before we get started. So I will briefly talk about, as I said, one of the important topics, which will be systematic conservation planning. After that, I will talk a lot about my case study in Brazil, which is on the Amazonian coast. So mangroves on that coast. And while I talk about this case study, I will tell you hopefully a lot also about community-based management. And as I said, a little bit about ecosystem-based management. But hopefully I'll be able to also show the synergies between the two, and you'll understand why I focus more on community-based management instead of talking so much about ecosystem-based management. Right, so let's jump to the introduction. So yeah, I think it's very important when we talk about mangrove conservation. For me, coming from this planning background, of course, it makes to me absolute sense to talk about systematic planning, or what you're gonna also find as systematic conservation planning. So I will summarize it. So I would just really in a nutshell explain what it is. So systematic planning basically involves choosing sites for conservation, or as the name suggests, in a systematic way. So that means that there are, among other things, clear criteria based on previously established goals. So there is a system, a specific procedure to, going about selecting these sites. So it's very important to say that, when you apply systematic planning to conservation, it is not a random process, choosing these sites. And it's not based on whatever is available or whatever is easiest to conserve. And of course, that goes not only for mangroves, but basically all ecosystems that, biodiversity features that we might want to protect. And I just want to mention the 6 steps that are highlighted in this paper from the year 2000, which is a very emblematic paper in this field. And they mention the first step as being, collecting data, compiling, and synthesizing data related to whatever it is that you want to protect. And then you would go about establishing explicit goals for the protection that you are aiming at. After that, you would then do what has been called for a while. I haven't seen this term so often in the literature anymore, but for a while we had a lot of what was called gap analysis. You might be familiar with the term, but that basically means looking at whatever is already there in terms of protection. So the existing protection of, say, a certain species that you want to protect. And as we see, for example, in this paper, it's even from 1995. So even before the systematic conservation planning paper, we already had people talking about gap analysis. I mean, we had this paper for the Amazon region in Brazil already pointing out to gaps in conservation. So again, going back to the steps, after looking at these gaps, you would then really go to the step of selecting the sites that are missing to achieve those goals that you established in step 2. So again, this specific step was usually referred to as conservation prioritization. I believe it still is. There's a lot of literature on that, a lot of involving prioritization algorithms. You might have heard of them, like Markson or Zonation. I myself worked with them for a while. And the next step would be the implementation. So usually it's important to say here that when we talk about systematic planning, or at least at the beginning of the year of the 2000s, there was a lot of talk about protected areas. So that was sort of the bulk of the implementation process was protected areas. Of course, that has been changing. Also, there are more and more spatial tools that are maybe not protected areas. These are still a bit contested, but protected areas are still the cornerstones when it comes to conservation of ecosystems and biodiversity features. And the last step, and I think it's very important, is, and usually neglected, unfortunately, is the maintenance of whatever was created in step 5. So this idea that you are checking that the protected areas that were established, they are still fulfilling the goals that they were originally conceived for, right? So it's often neglected. I mean, there's a lot of literature also talking about how protected areas are created without really looking at how they are being implemented and if they are fulfilling their targets. Some of them are called paper parks. Maybe you've heard this expression. But yeah, but we have an example, this last paper that I bring here, which is an analysis. It's also a type of gap analysis pointing towards the direction of a conservation prioritization exercise. And that was done in 2013 for the Brazilian marine environment. So I just brought you a few examples of papers related to systematic planning. And I just wanted to highlight, just to conclude this part of the presentation, why is this so relevant for conservation? Why was this idea of systematic planning brought to the spotlight? And the reason for that was that, and it's very important, that conservationists started to notice that the areas that were usually set aside for conservation were the easy ones. So the areas that no other activity was claiming, or areas where conservation wouldn't really generate any conflicts. I call them like the leftovers from other social economic activities that were then used for conservation. And of course, people started to notice that that could be a problem because these were not necessarily the areas that needed protection the most, right? So these discussions that I just mentioned, I mean, they can be applied to all ecosystems. So I'm not really here focusing on mangroves. They were really supposed to be all encompassing. But of course, when it comes to coastal and marine ecosystems, we could think of certain aspects that are particular to aquatic system, right? So for example, when we think of the activities, as you can see here in this figure, the activities that happen at sea or on the coast, we usually think of the surface, right? Whatever is happening at the surface. And we tend, policymakers or even some conservationists tend to neglect whatever is going on below water. But people started to think about this and started to try to figure out what would be the particular aspects of having systematic planning in aquatic systems. So at sea, on the coast, would anything be particular? Would anything be peculiar to these systems? And that's when we have marine spatial planning. So that's probably a term that you've heard. I will refer to as MSP, is largely known as just MSP. So that's when MSP came to the spotlight. And whenever I talk about MSP, I just like to read this definition that is found in this specific publication from 2009 by Euler and Dever. And I quite like it. I could go, I think, when I thought about it, I realized I could give a whole lecture just on this specific definition. It is so rich. There are so many aspects related to it, but I'll just read it to you and I will explain some of the emphasis. So you see the emphasis in the definition there, mine. So MSP is a public process of analyzing and allocating the spatial and temporal distribution of human activities in marine areas to achieve ecological, economic, and social objectives that have been specified through a political process. So that there's a lot to unpack there. Again, for the sake of time, I will not do that here. I just want to highlight two important points, in my opinion, are very important specifically for the lecture today. And it's to say that marine spatial planning, or MSP, is a public process. So it's not a private thing. It's something that is really supposed to be led by governments, and it's supposed to involve a wide range of actors, a wide range of social groups. And I also like to point out that there are ecological, economic, and social objectives to it. So it's not just about protecting biodiversity or biophysical features that want to be protected. It's really supposed to encompass a lot of objectives there. And because of that, because it involves so many objectives, and because it involves so many groups, it is in itself, I mean, the definition doesn't really say it. It says that it's supposed to deal with objectives that have been specified through a political process. But I believe that marine spatial planning itself is a political process, even though that's not really in this definition. Right, so this review paper from 2020, I think it does a really nice job at trying to integrate climate change into marine spatial planning. They call it their ocean planning, but they do mention marine spatial planning. So they're supposed to be synonyms in this case. And I mean, I will not go too much into the actual content of this paper. I can only recommend the read. But what I want to say is that, or actually I want to do an exercise with you now, and just take the opportunity to drink some water. But I would like you to think about, as we move finally toward mangroves, you don't have to say it. You can either write it in the chat or just think it to yourself. I mean, as we look at the MSP processes happening around the world, and that was back in 2019, the paper is from 2020. But, you know, as you can imagine, there was a pandemic in between. I can't imagine that not too much has changed regarding this figure. But, you know, looking at this map, and hopefully you will remember what we discussed in the previous lectures about the location of mangroves, or they are, what connection can you make, you know, in terms of how advanced MSP is, globally speaking, whether it is happening or not, and how it might be affecting mangroves. I would just give you a few seconds to think about it, and I will discuss it further in a bit. Right, so I cannot see the chat, but hopefully you had some time to try to make a connection with mangroves. And what we can see, I mean, very roughly, if we just take, you know, the distribution of mangroves worldwide and look at the development of MSP, we might come to the conclusion, or I think we should, that mangroves are possibly not benefiting from a lot of the MSP processes that are going on worldwide just by their location, right? I mean, the countries that hold mangroves, they are probably not the ones where MSP is really well advanced. And here I just want to say that first, MSP is not a silver bullet. It doesn't mean, you know, that MSP is able to solve all the problems that we have in marine systems. That's definitely not the case. There is actually a very interesting body of literature that brings some criticism of MSP. And I want to acknowledge that. I do think it's important to critically look at MSP as a political process and trying to understand what its limitations are. But I also, and I will, when I talk about Brazilian mangroves, I will say that there are other mechanisms to protect mangroves. So MSP is not, you know, the only thing, but it's important. And I think what I want to show with this figure is that MSP is probably not the driver of mangrove protection worldwide. Even though, again, we can see there are some exceptions, some countries that have mangroves that are well advanced in their MSP processes. But mangroves are being protected. I mean, if we consider MSP as the systematic way of doing it, we would come to the conclusion that a lot of mangrove protection is happening today in a non-systematic kind of way. And I hope I will illustrate that with the Brazilian case study. Right, so finally, let's talk about Brazilian mangroves. That's what I promised at the beginning. Again, these are the mangroves that I'm more familiar with, that I feel more comfortable talking about. That's, you know, and I'm not even talking about all Brazilian mangroves, but I wanted to show you where they are in Brazil. So basically, this is the distribution of Brazilian mangroves along the Brazilian coast. So a lot of the data that I will share with you, about Brazilian mangroves today comes from this publication. It's called Atlas of Brazilian Mangroves. I think it's only in Portuguese, unfortunately, but I recommend, if you can read in Portuguese, or if you just want to look at the nice photos that they have. It's a beautiful book, and it's available online. It's you can find the PDF very easily. But just very broadly speaking, we have in Brazil around, I mean, this figure changes a bit depending on where you find it, but about 14,000 square kilometers of mangroves along the Brazilian coastline. And back in 2017, there were about 120 protected areas that had mangroves inside them. Now, of course, this number has changed. It's been a while. I myself, where I work, I know of two protected areas that were created just about 2 weeks ago that have mangroves. They're basically mangrove protected areas. But yeah, just so you know, this is the figure that we're going to be working with. And at the time, back in 2017, there were about, of this 120, about 96% of them were in a category that we would, in Brazil, we have two categories, just to explain very briefly. We have the sustainable use protected areas, and we have the so-called strictly protected areas. The strictly protected ones roughly correspond to no-take areas, and the sustainable use ones they would fall into IUCN categories 5 and 6, if you are familiar with the IUCN classification system. And so most of Brazilian mangroves, they are inside sustainable use areas. Again, there are other mechanisms that protect mangroves. Protected areas in Brazil are not the only ones, or not the only mechanism to protect mangroves. But today we're really going to focus on protected areas because, as I said, the MSP process in Brazil is not really well advanced. And so far, protected areas being implemented in a non-systematic way, if you will, are the main mechanism to protect ecosystems in Brazil. So let's move on. Yes, okay, that works. So as I said, most of Brazilian mangroves are protected inside these sustainable use areas. And today I will focus on one specific type of sustainable use PAs in Brazil, and these are called extractive reserves. Now, the name is a bit tricky because I know that extractivism is usually seen under a very negative light, but this is not the kind of extractivism that we're talking about here. This is really about traditional populations. So these extractive reserves, according to law, they are supposed to be used by traditional extractive populations. These are the populations that I work with, human populations. And these populations, they have their livelihoods strongly dependent on extractivism and some other small-scale subsistence activities. And the basic objectives of these reserves are to protect the livelihoods of these human populations and at the same time ensure the sustainable use of the natural resources within this protected area. So again, two main goals: protect human populations, protect natural resources. And 30% of the areas that have mangroves, they fall into this category of extractive reserves. So an important category, not the most important one. I can tell you maybe later why. I'm not going to talk about the one that has the most mangroves in Brazil, but this is definitely one that deserves attention. Yes. So now finally, the case study that I promised. So this is the area, the specific area on the Brazilian coast where I work. So this is in the northern part of the country, in a state called Pará. So there are 5 protected areas. So actually, I worked in 4 of them. The 5th one, which is the one more to the west on this map, is the one that was created just 2 weeks ago. I already had the shapefile. I've had it for a really long time. It's been only some 20 years that they've been trying to create this area. So, not too long. It only took 20 years. So yes, it's been a very long struggle. I mean, the data, the shapefile had been going around for a really long time. It was finally created about 2 weeks ago. But yeah, these are the areas where I work. So you can see a small area of a specific mangrove strip on the Brazilian Amazon coast. And maybe I could use this. Right. So I have been working there for almost 10 years now. And what I've been doing is basically been doing a lot of interviews, a lot of surveys. I've been doing participatory mapping. As you can see in the photo, that's what I was doing at the time. So this is a local leader in one of the communities. I have been doing a little bit, or I did a little bit of GPS tracking with the fishers, and I did work on some spatial fisheries assessments. My current work focuses on social network analysis, but I will not talk about it today. I will really focus on the in-depth interviews and the surveys. So again, just to explain a bit more about these areas, they are called extractive reserves because extraction is allowed in these areas. They are allowed to fish everything in small scale. So small scale fisheries, some collection of wood for timber to build fishing traps and other uses. And it's very important to highlight about these areas that they are co-managed. So that means joint management, and there are several groups involved. So in that aspect, it has this common trait with MSP. So it is really a very political arena, as you can imagine. So in this case, we have the government at 3 different levels. So we have the federal government, the state government, the municipal government, we have local users, and we have academia and others. I will talk a little bit more about these users in a bit. How does co-management work, or what is co-management? So these protected areas, in theory, and I will explain this maybe later, hopefully have the time. They are run by a management council. In Portuguese, you can see that in the poster, it's called Conselho Deliberativo. So as the name suggests, it's a deliberative body, so it means that it actually makes decisions regarding these protected areas. And this body is presided over by the federal government agency that manages all protected areas in Brazil at the federal level, and this is called ICMBio for those who are familiar. But there is a federal government agency that is the head of the council. Now, I just talked about co-management, but in the title of the presentation, I said that I was going to talk about community-based management. So first, I think we need to, I wanted to reflect a bit on these two and to think about whether they are the same. So in order to do that, I will just go into the literature a little bit about community-based management, and in this case, even specifically for mangroves. It's a review paper from 2012, so it's been a while that this review came out, but I think it brings important aspects related to the definition of community-based management. So in this case, the paper itself says that it's when community-based management, mangrove management is about local communities' involvement in accomplishing the vital activities of resource identification, priority development, choice and adaptation of appropriate technologies for formulating and implementing sustainable management practices. So, it's a very straightforward definition of community-based management. And you still have the question of like, is it the same as co-management? Let's have a look. So this paper, it mentions that this idea of community-based mangrove management is actually built on a broader idea of community-based natural resource management. And there is this report from 2002 that brings a very interesting definition of community-based natural resource management, which of course applies to mangroves. And they say that this type of management involves the devolution of rights, responsibilities, and authority from central government to local communities. I really like this idea. I find this definition very very interesting to reflect upon, because it gives this idea of almost like passing on the baton from central government to local communities. So this idea of really returning or, handing over rights and responsibilities, but also seeing this as a sort of a process that, needs to start from the central government toward the local communities. So just bear in mind this definition. We'll go back to it in a second. And there is this book chapter from 1999, so it's been 25 years, but I think it makes a very interesting distinction between the two. So I would just very quickly read it. So they say that co-management requires that communities and government work together. So this idea really of joint management. So that means that it must be power sharing between government agencies and citizens. So maybe it's a bit broader than just local communities, with a stake in the common pool of resources. Co-management emphasizes bottom-up rather than top-down processes. And I do think that this also applies to community-based resource management. And user groups play an active role in decision-making. On the other hand, when we look at the definition of community-based resource management, we see that it is about, these communities playing a central role in identifying the resources, defining development priorities, choosing adapting technologies, and implementing management practices. So the difference is really that communities, they play a more central role in community-based management as compared to co-management. Right. So I just want to circle back to the extractive reserves that I was talking about earlier, and just to start thinking about the co-management and to see if there are any similarities, if there's any overlap with community-based management. So I think in order to do that, it's important to understand who the managers are, right? Who are these managers? Who are the people doing the management? So I mentioned a little bit about them before, but I want to go into a bit more detail. So we have a users association. So it's an association that is supposed to encompass all the local users, which are basically the local communities. And we have the government. In this case, it's the federal government that takes a sort of center stage when it comes to government in this arrangement. And the government has a few key traits that I think are very important when it comes to analyzing the co-management in this region. So the government has the institutional know-how to run the protected areas. It has the financial means, especially compared to the users association. It has the capacity in terms of like having qualified staff. It has the stability, and I marked it because I will talk a lot about it soon. And it has the credibility. So if any questions arises in the local context, is if, say, another government body has a question, has an issue that somehow relates to the protected area, they will usually turn to the federal government, to this federal management agency that I talked about, ICMView. So they are in a very different position when compared to the users association. And of course, there are other groups. So for example, there's academia, as I mentioned before. There are other organized civil society groups, NGOs, trade unions, independent users association. So yeah, so this is more or less the arrangement. These are the managers of the, and I think you can already see the imbalances, right? I mean, the unbalanced kind of relationship that might emerge out of this arrangement. So challenges. as I said, just by looking at the managers or the groups that are part of the management council, we can see a lot of the things that might not be going so well, or that might pose challenges to the effectiveness of this protected area, or protected areas. In this case, I'm talking about 5. I just wanted to bring this paper from 2018. It talks about one specific area of these extractive reserves, but I think the situation is very, very similar, when we compare with the other 4 or with the other 3 that were already created when this paper came out, had been already created. So what are these challenges? This paper mentions a lack of participation, overall participation. So a lot of people are not interested at all in what's going on. A lot of the people that are part of these local communities are not interested. There is an issue with lack of communication about the purpose of these protected areas. So I think it's an interesting thing to reflect on, that some people are not fully aware of what the protected area is about. So some of them, and that's also something that I identified myself. I will mention another paper that I published about this. And yeah, some people they don't really have the full picture about what the protected area is supposed to do. I can also talk about it later, maybe in the questions, that it is very tricky in Portuguese because the word extractive reserves or even protected areas does not have the word area in Portuguese at all. There are no hints to any sort of specific place or like a spatial delimitation. So it makes it very tricky for people to understand what a protected area is. There's a lack of legitimacy and trust. So these associations are supposed to represent the local communities. They are sometimes not perceived as legitimate. And the leaders, like the one that I just showed, some of them are not, or yeah, some people do not see them as the actual leaders of a town or a village. There's a lack of engagement. So again, some people are a bit tired, and I will show you in a bit the concrete data related to this. So the institutions are considered to be weak to be able to, implement all the activities related to these protected areas. There was very weak state commitment. So as you can imagine, depending on the kind of government that we have at the federal level, there are, the level of commitment and of interest in conservation varies a lot throughout time. And there's also, of course, a lack of investment and capacity building. Again, also related to this issue of more, higher level interest in conservation in general. So now I will talk a bit about a paper that we wrote. So this is directly related to the fieldwork that I was doing back in 2016, 17. When I was actually asking people, while doing these in-depth interviews and surveys, I was asking people about how they perceived success or effectiveness of these areas, if they thought that the areas are working well, were doing their job. And as you can see there, the results, it's a tricky one. It was definitely a tricky aspect, because most people will either have a negative view on the management. So it's important to emphasize here, it's not the area itself, but the current management, right? So the people that are managing the areas. So there was a negative view of management, or people had no idea what was going on. They were like, oh, I don't know, I'm not part of it, I'm not interested. So I think that in itself is already so both things are very problematic in my view. So just a bit of a sort of a timeline in terms of these challenges in the region. So I'm not sure how much you are familiar with the Brazilian reality and the recent developments in Brazil, but since, I'm going to say 2015, but that's debatable, there has been a national political socioeconomic crisis. there are several factors involved there, but yeah, there has been a crisis that has directly impacted both people on the ground. So, their ability to find a job, to secure their livelihoods, but also, as I just mentioned before, because these areas are so dependent on the federal level, the federal government, if there isn't a lack of interest by the federal government, then these areas are really in a bad shape. And of course, as you all remember quite well, I'm sure, there was a pandemic, right? And that is also a very relevant factor in the region. There was strong demobilization in the last few years. So I was there the last time in 2022 when I was able to talk to people. And from 2019 to 2022, things were bad before, but during the last few years of the first few years of the Bolsonaro government and the height of the pandemic, things got even worse. So yeah. So I go back to that definition that I read before that I thought was very central in terms of understanding community-based management. And I think, when we ask this question and try to apply it to this case, are there decentralized or devolved rights, responsibilities, and authority in the hands of these local communities? I would say not yet. I do see it as a process, and I do see, despite of all the bad news that I just told you about, I do see the process of things changing, but it's really it's a very bumpy road. There's a lot of back and forwards, a lot of wins and a lot of losses, and sometimes it's hard to even be able to identify, a direction where this is going. Right now, because we have a very different government, national government now, people are a bit more optimistic. I'm in touch with them also, even when I'm not there in person. And I was just talking to someone, they're telling me that they're having a lot of meetings, which is a good thing. So they're mobilizing again, but things take time. I just wanted to very quickly go over a few. So trying to expand the discussion a little bit, I just wanted to mention this paper that we published in 2019, so pre-pandemic. And we were looking at neotropical mangroves and also trying to connect it to community-based management. And what we saw, by looking at the literature really worldwide, was that community-based protected areas are seen to produce good conservation results. So that's what we saw back then. And I think this is still the case. And there's more and more literature mentioning that. But of course, the effectiveness of this type of management is still a topic of debate. So the jury is still out on, I mean, as you can imagine, the different kinds of arrangement, they are as diverse as there are mangrove systems. And I just want to take the few minutes that we have left to talk very briefly about ecosystem-based management, because I said I was going to talk about it. But I just wanted to show here really the synergies between systematic planning that I mentioned in the beginning, community-based management, because the way I understand ecosystem-based management, it is all about, and of course, I also got this from this interesting chapter that I mentioned there, where they kind of summarize the basic aspects of ecosystem-based management. And the first one is, to me, the most important one, which is that ecosystem-based management is holistic, right? So it's going to try to see humans as part of the ecosystem or as part of the management arrangement. So they have to be taken into consideration. But we also look at connected ecosystems. There's this idea of multifunctionality to ecosystem-based management. So you're going to look at, different ecosystem services and the different functions that this ecosystem has. It is based on evidence. So just as, just like in marine spatial planning and in systematic planning, you need to have data, right? You need to have this idea of synthesis and compilation of data to be able to perform any effective management strategy. There are different scales and levels to ecosystem-based management. So really this idea of thinking about, the temporal scale. So really thinking of the different sort of milestones to it. So considering different levels of time, but also when we look at the spatial scale, it's very important that we think of all the different levels, right? So we have the local level, which is basically what I showed here in these case studies, but we also have to look at the regional level. So how would this management relate to other management strategies to the other protected areas that are in the region, maybe even the national level, which in this case could be an MSP process that, again, is not happening in Brazil, at least. It requires policy coordination, of course, and it is adaptive and dynamic. So these are the basic traits of ecosystem-based management, and I think they are, kind of even very clear after everything that we talked about. I think it becomes very evident that this is how ecosystems in general, that's just not for mangroves, that's, for all ecosystems, how they should be managed. And just going back to mangroves to, narrow down mangroves now, when we talk about mangroves and people, and that, this is not something new. There's this chapter from 2010 coming out of this big project in the region where I work, where they already recognized mangroves as a social-ecological system. So really seeing this very intrinsic connection between people and mangroves. And to the extent that, after reflecting about community-based management and co-management, I realized that maybe what we should strive for is something that combines the two. So we have, local communities taking the central role in management, but also thinking about this idea of joint responsibility, so bringing in different actors. So it wouldn't be just the local communities alone, but really recognizing that governments also have an interest, and they are also stakeholders when it comes to mangroves, but also academia and NGOs in the region where I work. There are many, and they are also interested in mangrove management. So to me, it's not a question of if we should strive for community-based management or community-based co-management, but how it's done, we go about achieving that. And I just wanted to really close by mentioning this paper that we wrote in 2017, where we highlight some of these points that we consider to be very important for mangrove conservation. So seeing mangroves really as social-ecological systems seems to be key, and also taking into consideration community-based, but also ecosystem-based management. I think this is very relevant to a lot of mangroves. But I want to close this presentation. That's actually my last slide here. Asking, so that's the third question that you have there, like, are all mangroves or almost all mangroves social-ecological systems? That's something that we could think about. How could MSP be helpful in this case? How do you think that community-based management could be integrated into a larger scheme of MSP? And also, what does it take to achieve what I call community-based co-management? We can think of another term for it, but this idea of bringing these two elements together. This is it. This is my presentation for today. This is my contact. If anyone is interested in reaching out, feel free. I would love to hear your thoughts on everything that we discussed. Thank you so much for being here, for listening to me.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, for this very nice and comprehensive presentation. I think it's one of the highlights of mangrove ecology and conservation today, mostly due to the global changes we are witnessing everywhere in the world. And there's no other way except for including people in the efforts to conserve and manage mangroves. So I'd like to pass on to the people that are still watching us. If they have questions, discussions, comments, please. Raquel is already there. Fine, everyone's there. So we can open for questions and discussions now, please.
I think there's a question in the chat. So there was a comment. Sorry, having some trouble.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there is some asking asked about well, make a comment about the Southeast Asian being with MSP marine protection sites very poorly established. Rebecca, if you would comment on that.
Yeah, so that's when I showed that map, right? And then I think it's very clear. Again, maybe things are shifting a little bit. That map is from 2019, but I do think that you're right that the areas where mangroves are found, they are also, I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise. They are, in the tropics, and these are the countries that are in the global south. I mean, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them. And that means that, because as I mentioned, these MSV processes, they are long processes. They are very expensive because they require, a lot of articulation. They require some long-term planning by the authority that is going to implement it. And it's usually done at the national level. I mean, there are some regional experiences in terms of MSP. In Europe, for example, in the Baltic, or you have like California that did its own MSP, but it is a very demanding process, and therefore it is much harder for countries in the global south. Right. So thank you for pointing that out. And the question, I'm just going to read it out loud. So you mentioned that the interest in mangrove fluctuates based on the federal regime. Yes. Recently, mangrove conservation has been getting some attention for the role of mangroves in sequestering carbon, helping countries meet their targets. Yes. Has that helped mangroves get necessary attention in the recent years? That is a very good question. I mean, I do agree that mangroves are getting more and more attention. I just think it's important to recognize that not all countries, or not all governments are interested in climate-related targets. I mean, that also varies, right? So, for example, I don't know if you remember, we had the Bolsonaro government, which was the Brazilians here will know. It was very hard. I mean, zero. I'm not going to say zero interest, because the government changes, but we still have the state, right? We still have the structure, and some things move forward independently, sort of how the government, or what the government thinks. But yeah, it was a time, if you try to Google like the things that Bolsonaro said about climate change, and the same idea of like being a hoax, and so yes, so it's kind of hard. It really depends. I think sometimes we underestimate the influence of the federal government when it comes to really valuing and investing in conservation. And I think the recent years in Brazil have proven that, having sufficient data.
Well, Doug has another question. Several times you mentioned the importance of having sufficient data when you have specific community invasion protection areas. Can you ever have sufficient data to allow the committee to make efficient management? Yeah, that's a good question, because most of the areas you showed in your presentation, there are very few scientific knowledge about them. I would like also to see your comment about that.
Yeah, when are enough data enough? I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's a very important question, because it's interesting to see that for this area this area that I showed, there was this big project that I mentioned. It's called Madame. So for people that work with mangroves in Brazil, they might have heard of this project. It was a big German-Brazilian collaboration that lasted for 10 years, from 95 to 2005. And there was massive amount of data produced in these 10 years. It's really like it's one of those rare projects that lasts for 10 years. I mean, nowadays, what kind of projects do you have that last 10 years, right? Sometimes if you can get funding for 1 year, people are already very excited about that. So that project was very successful in terms of collecting a lot of data. And it's very interesting to see that one of these extractive reserves that I showed, the Bragança one, is the only one that has a management plan. And if you read the management plan of that area, you're going to see that a lot of the diagnostic part of the plan was based on all the data that this German-Brazilian project was able to collect. So at the time of the creation of the areas, but also in terms of helping with the construction of the management plan, these projects were very important. And they did, I mean, the data that they were able to collect, and even up until today, you still have a lot of data that guide, for example, the temporal closures. So I don't know if you're aware, like in Brazil, there's a temporal closure when it comes to the mangrove crabs. So there are a few days every month for the first 4 months of the year, when you have the new moon, that you're not supposed to catch any of these crabs. And this is also heavily built on scientific data that was produced, along the coast, but also this project contributed a lot. So I don't think there's a line when you can tell, oh, we have enough data now. Also because these data, and I think in the context of, of climate change, you're going to need, constant sort of updates, right, of what you already have. You're not going to have a model that will be able to kind of, give the final word and say, oh, we don't need any data from now on. But of course, we cannot wait forever, to have the perfect data set in order to be able to implement measures. So I think in this specific context, there's not a lot of data that is needed, to work with. I don't think the problem is really data or lack of data. I think the problem is mainly political. But yeah, you can't get enough data, right? I mean, that's just how it is. Not sure if I answered, but
Rebecca, I would like to make a comment, and maybe I'd like your contribution to that. I think one important thing of community-based management, these forms of interaction with local population, vis-a-vis the environmental legislation, is that normally we discuss a lot and fight till the law is approved. Once the law is approved, it's static. No one thinks any longer about that. But the world nowadays is not static. So in many areas where I work, many thematics, for instance, pollution, what we see is there's a disclosure between the law and the reality. So if you apply the law that was created decades ago to the present situation of the coastal zone, it won't protect anything that was supposed to protect. And then community-based management may be a way of making the law a little bit more flexible and adaptable to new constraints brought in through the global change. So I'd like to comment on that because this may be very important for instance, the Ministry of the Environment in Brazil. I think the last time we discussed that, they were worried about this static character of laws regarding a changing world.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think this is definitely one of the major benefits of trying to incorporate more and more elements of community-based management into, even if you have just a co-management scheme. So for example, the extractive reserves, according to the law, they are supposed to have their plans reviewed every 5 years. That's the rule. But as you are well aware, and I think some of you might imagine that actually a lot of protected areas in Brazil don't even have a management plan.
Mhm.
So that poses already a huge threat. I mean, the creation of a management plan is a very costly process. I mean, you need to hire, usually you have to hire a company. You need to have a lot of funding for that, and not all protected areas are able to do it. So I think the management plan is key in even starting this process of, you know, adaptation and of being able, I mean, you have to have something to start working with, right? So I think it's a major problem in Brazil that we have so many areas that don't have management plans. But yeah, I do think that the communities are the ones that are closest to the, you know, the changing processes. I don't know how familiar you all are with mangrove, or the coasts where mangroves are. So they are very dynamic, especially in the north of Brazil, very dynamic coasts. They are always changing. So change is not something new for these communities. They are used to change, right? Changing is sort of the pattern. They are able to deal with that. And it's another research project that I do that is more on climate change. What we see is that some people even have a hard time identifying climate change related processes because there's so much change in these coasts that for them it's normal. Like when you say, oh, change is accelerating, or it's a different kind of change, they have a hard time, you know, seeing that. But yeah, I do think that they have, because they are closest, you know, to these sort of everyday on the ground developments, they have the capacity, or they should have the capacity to lead the adaptation process. That's one of the cornerstones of ecosystem-based management, as I mentioned. But again, I do see a lot of challenges when it comes to the sort of the, how can I put it, the capacity building of these communities. There's a lot that needs to be done there, so that we can get that process rolling. I think, Mondana, do you want to ask a question before I read the chat? Yes.
Sorry, I just quickly wanted to, going back to the map. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. And going back to the map from the beginning where you showed, like a lack of MSP, I think it was, along the tropics. Like, are the challenges similar across different regions of the world? Is there value in comparing case studies from, Asia and Latin America, for example, or do you think that the challenges are just so specific, for example, if they're political challenges? Yeah, like that it's.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's actually an excellent question. There is so I haven't seen a lot of literature comparing the process. There is a paper by Charles Ehler, one of the authors of the 2009 paper, that kind of consolidated the idea of MSP. So he has a paper from a couple of years ago where he analyzes the processes. So I think he calls it 20 years of marine spatial planning. So he looks at the processes that have happened, and you see a lot of these processes are happening in the global north. So that's that's one similarity that you can see straight away for these reasons that I just mentioned. So yes, I do think it would be very interesting to look at the different problems that countries in the global south might be facing when it comes to implementing MSP. I do think it has a lot to do with political instability. So, that's what we see in Brazil, all the efforts. As I said, we do have, we have some efforts that are not exactly MSP, but they are kind of in that direction. We have the ALA project. I mean, there are other initiatives that they don't replace MSP, but they are kind of going in that direction. But they are as I said, they're very dependent on this state commitment that this paper from 2018 talked about. And when that is lacking, it is very hard. I mean, I do believe that the federal government is the one that has the institutional capacity to make these processes happen. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to have MSP, or at least not in Brazil, to have MSP at lower levels, I don't know, like a state doing MSP. I mean, you have it in the US, but I think in Brazil it wouldn't make a lot of sense. So yeah, but as you said, it would be very interesting. I can recommend if anyone's interested. I actually have so there's a platform. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's called Panorama. So it's about conservation initiatives worldwide, and they have a session. It's co-developed by this project called I'm not sure you can see it, Blue Solutions. So that's an initiative also that involves the GIZ and IUCN. So there's a lot of institutions involved here. I was an intern in this project back in 2016 for a while. And they do have this platform called Panorama. I can only recommend that you check it out because it's very interesting. They try to take conservation initiatives, then they try to identify building blocks in these initiatives to try and break it down into smaller elements that could be comparable. You can even kind of filter the different initiatives by building block. So I think there's a lot of material out there. It is very hard to synthesize. So that's the kind of synthesis work that is very, very hard to do because, as you said, like so many different realities, it's hard to bring all of this together, but that's definitely something that needs to be done, hopefully, in the near future.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Rebecca, there are two questions on carrying capacity. You see in the chat. It's from Sujip Jibena. When the ecosystem reaching its, exceeding its capacity, which is something you need a lot of data to establish. Where is it? The ecosystem capacity, carrying capacity. And what is the suggestion for shifting to alternative livelihoods? Well, this is another example that I was telling that, changing things. We be able to change our actions toward that, which sometimes the law doesn't allow. And there is a second question from Camilo on the carbon sequestration. That will be carbon credits. That will be a topic of discussion in future seminar next week onwards. And also problems of opportunities in Brazil with any changes on community management of mangroves. So if you can go through the two of them there.
Yeah, I will try to very briefly answer. Thank you so much for the questions. So just very briefly on the carbon credits. So as Professor Duji said, I do believe we're going to have more of that in an upcoming lecture. I just want to mention for the reality of these extractive reserves where I work in Brazil, what I have seen so far, and again, I haven't really done research specifically on that, but just by talking to the people in these in-depth interviews, what I see is that there is actually already a lot of conflict around the carbon credits. It is very contested. As you can imagine, it is not something that everyone is on board with. I mean, there's a lot of people involved in management. They are very skeptical of carbon credit initiatives. On the other hand, you have other people that are totally on board, and I think I even heard someone mention. I mean, I didn't have the time to look into this any further, but I heard some people say that there have been already some agreements signed in the region without further discussion, without really, I mean, the associations or the head of the associations signing contracts with big companies without really taking it, to the public for like further discussion, like in the discussion in the management councils. That is a huge source of conflict, and I can see how that will escalate in the next few years. I mean, I don't want to say it's something completely bad, but I do see that with grain of salt. There has to be something that we're looking at with a more critical eyes. And about the limits to extraction, so that's actually a very interesting topic because I was looking, as I said, I did some spatial fisheries assessment in the region. So again, I'm going to restrict my answer here to this region specifically. there have been several studies on the carrying capacity when it comes, especially when it comes to crab fisheries. That's what most people look at, because that's actually the biggest activity sort of in this region. So crab fishery, mangrove crab fishery, and the interesting conclusion is that the mangrove crab population is doing surprisingly well. There is no risk of any sort of unsustainable use, even though there were some alarms. Like I myself, I was a bit worried a few years back when some processing started in the region. So people started to process the crab meat and to sell it to regions in Brazil that are very far away, like Rio Grande do Sul. If you can imagine that kind of that kind of transportation, it's very, very far. But they were able to either freeze the meat. So that was kind of, so that raises a few flags in the region. That is true. But overall, the crab stocks are really well protected. However, there is the worry in the region that the activity will become unsustainable, not because the mangroves will run out of crabs, but because I don't know how many of you are familiar with the act of eating crabs, but for some of us, or some of you that eat crabs, if you've ever experienced it, it is much easier when the crab is big, because you basically have to break it apart and get the meat out. And there is a fear that the crabs are getting too small to the point that the population will still be feasible, but it won't be feasible anymore to be commercialized as, you know, something that can be eaten like that. And Alex made a comment, but I'm not sure if I understand. Do you want to explain, Alex?
I'm talking about crab eaters, raccoons
Oh,
that eat crabs. And
I was talking about
most people take the crabs
crab
from the
eaters.
They
raccoons.
don't care about the size
The
of.
raccoons are passing hungry, but not in Pará.
I was
Uh,
talking about other crab eaters, not the raccoons. Yeah, no, this is very interesting. Yeah. I don't think we have this problem in the north, but maybe I will check next time I go there whether we have raccoons eating crabs there.
Well,
Here is very common. We find the animals in the mangrove. Okay, Professor, can continue. Sorry.
yeah, no, just asking if anyone has any other questions or comments. No? Well, I'd like to thank deeply Rebecca for this excellent presentation. As I said in the beginning, I think humanity has to discuss not only on mangroves, but everywhere community-based management. I do think it's the only way to really face a changing world. And well, Rebecca is in the mainstream of this research line. So thank you very much for your time, and see you probably in May in Brazil or somewhere else. Yeah. Thank you all for the audience. On next Wednesday, we have a completely different seminar on pollution and contamination, how mangroves can help in this arena of contamination. And I invite you all to be there. And then I go back to Raquel to close the section. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. See you on next Wednesday.